Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing? It's been a really, really long week, hasn't it? Feels like it's a stretching time. So I'm delighted to invite two amazing thinkers, feelers, collaborators, artists, translators, storytellers here to both honor the publishing of two books, but also to share with you their experiences and their ways of thinking about this question of the Nordic, who is included, and the histories of different kinds of stories and trajectories that find their way into the bigger house that this museum and this community represents. So we have Professor Nana Osei Kofi, who has joined us today from, and now I do have to read my notes because we know each other differently, from the School of Language and Culture and Society at Oregon State University. You're Professor Emerita of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And Nana's research really centers on two primary lines of inquiry, focused on justice and the politics of difference, which is a running theme through the book. And also thinking about the experiences and conditions faced by people of African descent in Europe. So Nana's work is really contributing to a wider set of inquiry questions about Afro-European identity and how it is quite distinct, not just in tone, but also in kind of theoretical frameworks from the wider African diasporic experience. So thank you, Nana, and welcome. And then we have Olivia Gunn, who is joining us locally here as Associate Professor in Scandinavian Studies, and also the Svara Arested Endowed Chair in Norwegian Studies. And Olivia's work is bridging comparative literature, gender, women, and sexuality studies, also children's studies to a certain extent. And you're working on North American translations of Ibsen at the moment? Adaptations, yes, and questions of progress and transformation. So welcome, Olivia, to this gathering. So we're here to commemorate the launching of two books. Do you have your book, Nana, just so we can sort of hold it up? Nana's book. And on Afro-Swedish identity. And Olivia's translation of Camara Joof's, I talk about it all the time. But some of you, hopefully, have had a chance to begin to peel back the layers of this book, but some of you maybe are hearing this for the first time. So what we thought we would do is that both Nana and Olivia would share an object or a story that comes from their work, and then maybe give a short reading for 5 minutes. And then we will open up for a conversation around a range of different themes that connect and emerge from their work. And then hopefully we might have a little bit of time to also get questions from the floor. All right? Great. Nana, please. Thank you.
So what I'm going to share is a recording from 1981. It's a recording that features me. It's a Swedish radio program, and I'll say a little bit more about that after you hear it. I use it to open a chapter where I talk about autobiography, and autobiography is one of the most common ways that Black Europeans have historically used to write themselves into European history. So I'm going to move to this, and I think there's a little bit, there, with the sound, there's a little bit of a delay, so I think there are a couple of words that are cut off, so if you do, if you know Swedish, the words are Jag bodde I Ghana, and then it goes on.
Ghana ligger I Afrika, I Västafrika. Nej, i förhållande till Afrika så är det ett litet land. Det är mindre än Sverige. Men det bor mer människor än i Sverige. Ghananer kallas de för. Det är mycket fält och så. Och växtodlingar. Och så är det inte så många vägar. Det är rätt så mycket skog också. Det finns, jag vet inte hur många, men det finns huvudstaden som heter Accra. Och sen så andra staden heter Kumasi och det var där jag bodde. Det är många marknader, stora marknader och det är där de säljer allt möjligt där. Ibland så, till exempel om man inte kan få tag på ägg så finns det att köpa där. För att allting finns alltid där men det kan vara väldigt dyrt att handla där. Och man blir ofta lurad på priserna men det går också att pruta när man handlar där. Och det går inte i de andra varuhusen. Och det finns allting från kläder till mat och sådär. Precis allting går det väl nästan att få tag på det. Men det kan ju kosta en hel del. Det är en stor plats och det är öppet där hela tiden. Jag tror inte på natten men de sitter där hela dagen. Alltid. Det är rätt så konstigt så om man kommer på kvällen så är det alldeles tomt där för det har varit så fullt hela tiden. För då, när det är öppet så är det alldeles fullproppat med folk och då finns det olika liksom, delar där de säljer kött och olika delar där de säljer kläder och sånt, så, grönsaker och så. Och då så några som säljer där då så de som levererar kött och så, då kommer de dit med köttet. Det finns vägar men det är inte så många vägar. Och i stan så är det inga träd och så. Och det finns några varuhus men det är väldigt lite i dem urplockat.
So this is from a chapter called Narrating the Afro-Swedish Experience. So in 1981, at the age of 12, I was part of a radio series produced by Ungdomsradion, which is Swedish Public Service's youth radio arm. And the program, Ett sommarlov, featured young people who shared experiences from their lives and played their favorite music during a 30-minute segment. And it, for those of you who are familiar with Swedish radio, it mirrors a very popular adult program that's still running to this day. So during my time slot, I introduced myself as being from Gothenburg and went on to talk about a range of matters pertaining to Ghana, viewed through the eyes of a 12-year-old going on 30, or at least that's what my sister will tell you. So I talked about things like geography, demographics, the environment, languages spoken, schooling, food, economic issues, and religiosity. And as I was listening to this and transcribing it, I had to ask myself, what is a 12-year-old doing having these kinds of conversations? And I think I grew up in a family of educators, and so I think that these were the conversations that I was hearing at the kitchen table and sort of absorbing that. So what strikes me about my 12-year-old self-narrative is the extent to which I understand Sweden and Gothenburg as home, and the diligence with which I make meaning of my experience in Ghana by contrasting every matter I discuss in relation to Swedish conditions. Sometimes this is very explicit, sometimes it's implicit. At no point do I mention the fact that my father is Ghanaian, and that I too, therefore, am Ghanaian. I say nothing about the significance of racialization, despite having experienced what Stuart Hall refers to as race as a floating signifier, in the taunts uttered by children in Ghana who would see me as white, and those in Sweden who would see me as black. The narrative I shared was the narrative of an outsider learning about a new culture and place. Racialization as a construct or any notion of belonging in relation to Ghana was completely absent. At this stage of life, it's clear that there was no doubt in my mind about my Swedishness, about my sense of belonging. Thank you.
When we were preparing for today, Temi asked me, we were talking about personal objects or connections, and Temi said, well, you know, you have a family connection to the museum, maybe you have an object there that you could talk about, and my immediate response to that was, that has nothing to do with this book. What are you talking about? And then, of course, I had to think about it and think, okay, maybe it has something to do with this book, starting very practically with the fact that I can read Norwegian and speak Norwegian, so I have a skill set that enables me to translate Norwegian, and that absolutely has to do with being Norwegian American. But I think the real reason I resisted this idea was that, you know, for me, Norwegian American culture is one thing. It's something that I am but did not choose, and the subjects I teach, Norway, Norwegian culture, are something else, and I do work to keep those apart. Most of my research none of my research almost has anything to do with Norwegian Americans. And I just have this kind of feeling of, okay, those are two different things. And my expertise and my place in a Department of Scandinavian Studies, I try not to tie that to my family. But I, you know, had to think a little deeper. Thank you, Temi. And so I brought this bunad here, which is a Nordlandsbunad, or a national costume from the far north in Norway. And I thought, oh, I inherited this from my mother, and I don't wear it anymore for complicated reasons, including it doesn't fit anymore. But I did stop wearing it before it didn't fit, and I've since given it to my niece. So I thought, okay, this bunad is also in Camara's book, something that she inherited from her mother, inherited from her family. And I thought, oh, I didn't really think of this as a personal connection. This made me look into the bunad itself, which was created in 1928. It was created in the southern part of Nordland, but it doesn't have any relationship to peasant clothing in Nordland. That sometimes happens with national costumes, that there's a connection with peasant clothing. But in this case, there isn't any. And there's some features on it. The pocket purse, which I don't have on there, is post-World War II. And the cap, which you also don't see there, is from 1984. So this is not such an old tradition as people might think. And it's not necessarily even connected with the traditions from that place. This is relevant. Why? Well, I'm about to read an excerpt from a book that's about mothers and inheritance, but it's also about how we remember and imagine and reimagine tradition. For example, Camara mentions that this is a blue coastal bunad, and I did some research and found out there's no evidence in history that the blue bunad was connected to the coast. That's a myth that people have kind of invented afterwards and repeat. And then it made me start asking questions about, you know, cultural myth. There's a bunad police in Norway, right? You have to wear the bunad the right way. And I have a piece of jewelry that my cousin lent me on there because I didn't have the correct piece. So it's not right. It's kind of not the right combination of things, and that fits, I think, with these questions. And then finally, just before I read, you know, what right would I have to wear this dress? And I'm not saying that people here who might wear dresses like these don't have the right, but it's interesting to think about what it means to you, why you wear it, and what you think gives you the right to wear it. And I have worn it in Norway, and of course no one would ever ask me, you know, just by looking at me. If they talk to me, they might change their mind. But just by looking at me, they wouldn't ask me, who gave you the right to wear this? So I'm going to read 2 short chapters from Camara's book, National Costume 1 and 2. We have a national costume in our family, a children's bunad from Nordland County. It was embroidered by Inge Rørvik, one of 3 women who created the design. The Nordland bunad is the national costume most often awarded, unofficially, Norway's most beautiful. I'm not talking about the green version, but the blue coastal one, and that's important. Our children's bunad is passed down in the family to kids old enough to wear it. When I was 6 years old, it was my turn. My maternal grandma is withdrawing money from the ATM. I'm standing in the square and I'm glowing. I'm swishing my skirt. I'm not wearing the traditional bonnet. It's the 17th of May, Norway's Constitution Day, and two ladies, I remember them as ancient, at least 100 years old, come over to me and say something about my dress. So you're wearing a bunad from Norrland, are you? Yes, I say, and explain that it's always been in my family, that when a person is old enough, they get to wear it, and I'm old enough because I'm turning 7 years old in 2 weeks. And I spin around and pose. One of the ladies hits me on the arm with her umbrella. She tells me I have no business wearing this dress. It's disrespectful of me to wear it. You have no right, she says. And then I get another smack on the arm. I should be ashamed standing there and openly bragging about something that isn't mine. I rub my arm and stare at her. Then Grandma comes running over swinging. She hits one of the ladies with her purse. She raises her fist threateningly and tells them to go to hell, shouts that they are the ones who should be ashamed. The ladies run away and Grandma is a superhero. She is furious and passionate, and she dries my tears and takes me to the amusement park. And even though I'm not allowed to have sugar at home, she buys me 2 whole bags of cotton candy, and I eat both bags and get so sick that I throw up after the carousel ride on the national costume. The listener gets really uncomfortable when I tell this story, so much so that the atmosphere gets tense, until Grandma shows up and saves the day, and the puke hits the bunad, hits this symbol that maybe doesn't mean so much after all. When the story is over, we sit there relieved, shocked, and in disbelief, but also with a feeling of amused relief. We get to believe that we would have been Grandma in this story. We're also grateful for Grandma, because if Grandma exists, then we get to be her, and not those old ladies. Never the lady who hit me with her umbrella. But what about her friend, the one who said nothing? Her silence was just as impactful as the umbrella to me. But the truth is that Grandma only arrived later, after the ladies had left. There's a line from hell at the ATM on the 17th of May. They didn't have Venmo in the 1990s. Grandma couldn't help not being there, just like I couldn't help standing there. And because I didn't say anything, she couldn't do anything. And the smack wasn't so hard, and it wasn't long before I stopped rubbing my arm and got distracted by the parade. Still, when I was a teenager and started talking about what happened, I put Grandma in the story, almost from the very beginning, because without Grandma, the story is too much to bear. It's too much for the listener, and sometimes it's even too much for me. And after all, it's just another thing that happened to me. The point of the story is to say this happened to me. It happened when I was little, when I didn't have words to talk about it. I didn't have a language to explain it to anyone, so I didn't say anything. And as an adult, I'm angry. I'm angry on behalf of the girl in the bunad, and I want to tell you about it. It matters to me that you understand why I'm angry, but I don't want to be the one who dominates the conversation again with a story about something that happened to me. This happened to me, again making everything about me and the color of my skin. So I turn it into a story about Grandma the superhero, sometimes for your sake, but probably mostly for my own.
Thank you both for those beautiful and very moving readings and object stories. I forgot to introduce myself earlier. My name is Dr. Temi Odumosu. I'm an assistant professor at the Information School at the University of Washington. And you might be wondering why I'm here. Some of you might have seen me before. But I'm here because I spent almost 10 years living and working in Denmark and Sweden as an outsider looking in. So it's been very beautiful reading both books and thinking about the places from where we know, which is language that comes from Nana's book. Our inner culture, right? The culture of stories and memory that's inside us. Much of that is places. So when we're having a conversation today, what I thought we would do is maybe kind of explore this dynamic between memory and bodies and stories and space, the power of storytelling, what it means to actually translate in different kinds of ways, not just the literal translation of the book, but also moving words from Swedish to English and what comes in that process. And maybe also thinking about, transformations in teaching Scandinavian studies and teaching about Nordic identity. But since we started with such a powerful engagement with this strong object, I wondered if you could both reflect on what I see as a tension between the need to tell stories and to share testimony, and the effects of having to continuously tell those stories. Nana, one of the respondents in your book talks about, keeping certain memories at a distance, otherwise you just become disillusioned or you just cry all day long. And then I think Camara describes it as low frequency feelings in the book. So I just wondered if you could both reflect on the kind of tensions of giving so much of yourself through story in the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, it actually, your question makes me think about something in Camara's book that is about, or maybe it was when we had a meeting with her, but she talks about this idea of never using theater and performance as therapy. And so whatever she puts forth is something that she's always worked through on her own or with a therapist before it shows up in a performance space. And I think that there's something wise in that, in thinking about what it is that we share and what we're able to give and the ways in which we're able to give. I often use a quote from Manning Marable, who was a Black sociologist, since passed away, but it's a very short expression. The expression is simply struggle where you are. And I'll come back to that throughout my academic career and sort of life and the work that I do in thinking about what that means, that struggling where we are can be the big things, but can also be the small things. And I think there are a lot of times the small things might be what we overlook or feel as though it's not enough. And that puts us on that trajectory to engage in giving of ourselves in ways where there's nothing left of ourselves, right? Giving what we don't have to give, essentially. So that's, a little bit of thinking about those things. And, the question of effects or response or thinking about audience or who we're doing this for, what do we want out of this, I have multiple thoughts on that. It's, if I'm in a conversation with a graduate student, it is about, the dissertation needs to get done. And so there's a way of needing to understand who is going to be responding to it and what it needs to contain. But otherwise, I'm much more lean towards the idea of that you do the work that needs to be done. Right? Do you know and feel within you what that work is? And that's the work that you need to do, because otherwise, if our work becomes overdetermined by who we think the audience is, then it's no longer our work, and it's no longer what we set out to do.
Yeah, so, I've heard Camara talk about this a lot. And Camara, of course, is the author of the book, and I'll try to represent some of her ideas about it. Certainly first, the book is called I Talk About It All the Time. So it's talking and talking and talking and talking about it all the time and always feeling that it's never enough. It's interesting with the smallest things, your reference to like giving little pieces away, or that Camara talks about in the goal in this book was to get down to the tiniest microaggression possible so that nobody could say, oh, but that's a big, unusual, violent, racist thing. And those things happen only on occasion. And so her goal was to be like, okay, I have to tell those kind of striking, violent stories too. And there's some very disturbing stories in the book. But what she really wanted to tell was the tiny little everyday things. And of course, she talks about that being exhausting. In terms of translation, although maybe we'll get back to that, but I did Camara, the author of the book, just gave a talk at Scandinavia House in New York City, and I imagine we'll turn to translation, but one of the things she mentioned was in her own translation work, because she's translated Claudia Rankine's Citizen, and she was talking about the need to sort of create anti-Black language that didn't exist in Norwegian in order to translate the book. And that the strange ethics of that, or the strange ethics of writing plays about racism, and then asking actors to go on stage and retell her stories, fictional in the case of theater. But this sort of, I guess it's about an interesting transference of story from body to body and what that repetition is like. I'm often struck by the way I can forget the violence of the book as the translator, and then reread it or listen to Camara read it and go, oh, that's so brutal. How did I forget? How am I able to forget that? Partially maybe I want to forget it, but it's probably more complicated than that as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because those effects that you're talking about, then they're not just happening on an interpersonal level, but there's also this other structural, cultural, the colonial vara and other signs, symbols, languages, the N-word defined 5 different ways, or the recalibration of the N-word in order to say something but not say it. There's all of these other ways in which a life story gets, people are being attacked by the culture, by the environment, in ways that show up in the writing, and then they kind of hit you with this intensity. Yeah. Could you say something about translation, not just in terms of your own experience of kind of carrying Afro-Nordic woman's story into the mainstream, but also with your work, Nana, thinking about finding language or shifting language and the decisions that you've made in terms of capitalization, all sorts of small adjustments you've made to be able to articulate something that's very precise about the culture that doesn't mimic something else unnecessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and it was really important for me to get it right, whatever right means. So one of the things that I spent quite some time on was how to translate AfroSvensk. And so AfroSvensk is a single word in Swedish, but typically in African diaspora studies, we hyphenate, or a lot of folks hyphenate, so Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Portuguese, whatever that might be. And so I actually, there's in Sweden, Svenska språkrådet, it's about the preservation of the language, but they also give advice on language and how the Swedish language should be used. So what I took from that and looking at other parts of the world and this idea of hyphenation and what it does, what I ended up with was basically Afro-Swedish as a close compound word. And because I didn't want the hyphen to function as a tool of separation. And I also didn't want it to create an asymmetry between Afro and Swedish, because that is what that would do. I did, in terms of avoiding that asymmetry, part of what I also did was I capitalized A and I capitalized S in Afro-Swedish to sort of fully avoid that, if you will. So that's one of the things that I did. I took out, or not took out, but there are things like the non-prefix that gets used a lot, and that happens here sometimes as well, but so icke-svensk, for example, so it's a negation of an identity rather than something that speaks or affirms who someone is, and so So I just talk about that and how I worked with that to actually speak to who people were rather than who they weren't in the work. And a couple of other things with that. Afrophobia is another term that I take up, and that's so the argument, and this has certainly, there's certainly been conversation about this in Sweden, about, you know, anti-Black racism is not a phobia, it's not a fear, it's not a sort of, you know, it becomes medicalized and thinking about it as a phobia, and instead trying to talk about it as anti-Black racism, as a much more accurate way of speaking to that. And I think those are the big ones. Maybe one more, färgblind, so colorblind, is another interesting term. And I lean on other scholars who speak to or have suggested the use of color evasiveness instead, that much more accurately describes what we're talking about. Colorblind, again, also medicalizes something, but so, because it's not that you don't see color, but you are in fact evading it through these processes. So yeah, so those are a couple of things that I worked with around translation.
I'm thinking of the fact that all the translation work, that you did a lot of translation work for this book. And so one of the things that does is make this material available to a lot of readers. And I first translated this book for teaching. That was the initial motivation. And I actually do translate quite a few things for teaching, because this kind of material is then much more accessible to students. And I did notice, I'm kind of curious about it, that in your book, the N-word is N star, 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 star. And that reminds me of a sort of translation process where when I first translated this for students, I did the same. And then, you know, when I was going to submit it for publication, I put the words back in, because all the sort of, both the Norwegian N-word and the American N-word are in this book, and other anti-Black racist words. And they're not my words, they're Camara's words. But I've had a lot of conversations about why. And I did put a footnote in for students and said, you can talk to me and ask me why I did this. It's my choice, it's not Camara's choice, it's not a perfect choice. And one of the things that Camara said recently was that in the translation of Claudia Rankin's poem, that in Sweden they chose not to put the N-word in. And from her perspective, that was like, okay, well, it might be uncomfortable for you to read, both the translators in that case were white, and it might be uncomfortable for you to read, but it was probably more painful for Claudia Rankin to write, was one thought she had. And I was thinking about that, I thought, did I avoid that word in the beginning to protect myself? And the answer to that is like, yes, but it's more complicated, because I didn't want students to be angry at me, but I also did think of care and protection of students as well, that this is like a more painful word for some of my students than it is for me. And when I submitted to the press, that was one of the responses, oh, you can't put the American N-word in the book. They didn't have a problem with the Norwegian N-word, but you can't, that's not okay. And I was like, it's not my word, and I think it has to stay in there. Yeah. So those are a few thoughts. Maybe you could, yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I'm thinking about it. It's interesting. I do a little piece on the Swedish N-word and how it, in spelling, it might differ to you from the American version, but it is, in fact, I would argue, the very same word, or has the same meaning. And I think, for me, just in being in conversation with people, in interviews, and people sharing of their lives and their experiences, for me, I think as an author, it was about, everybody knows what it means, right? Everybody knows what the word is, and so I didn't feel as though it necessarily added anything. And there were also certainly people who were very specific about, had very strong feelings about whether that should or should not be a part of a text, and leaning toward that it should not. I think it's we have to think about what is the purpose of the work, and the purpose of the work is to educate, the purpose is to create understanding. And so is this crucial to that? No.
Could I ask you to maybe say something about, since Olivia, you were talking about initially translating for the classroom, how has Scandinavian studies shifted or adapted in recent years in order to open up to these questions more fully? What is it like to teach these kind of texts in a Scandinavian studies classroom? And then for Nana more broadly, to talk about whether it's gender, whether it's identity, sexuality studies, or even Black studies in a US context. What's changing for you?
That's a big question. And I think the answer, of course, is that many things have changed and some things haven't changed much. And Nana, in your book, you talk a lot about sort of lots of discourse that is about, talking about Afro-Swedish populations as oppressed populations, or populations that have, problems that need to be fixed, and maybe some treating of Black community as sort of the object of study, and that there's not enough then room for more complex voices, also joy, Black joy, which you talk about in your book. With students, it's like kind of linking back to translation, there's a lot of questions also that come up in Nana's book about how the relationship between the United States and Black communities in the United States, and where they're similar to and not similar to Black communities in the Nordics, and that kind of trying to figure that out. In Camara's book, she doesn't use a lot of Norwegian-specific discourse. And she's talked about, avoiding words that are dominant in Norway, or not dominant, but that people are playing with and doing activist work around, like melaninrik, which means melanin rich. And then we have the other term, melaninfattig, melanin poor. And that, that's an attempt, I think, on the creators of those terms to move a little bit away from racializing terms. But for Camara, she's like, okay, it took me a really long time to say I'm Black. And she's excited about that term, I think, as a possibility for coalition building, even as she wants to say, okay, the United States is not the only place who has discourse around this or culture around this, and push back against that. I think a lot of my students recognize, either there's three things that students respond to the book, three ways. One is they go, oh, I didn't know there was racism in Scandinavia, or I didn't know there was racism outside the United States. They're like convinced it's an American problem, which is interesting since in Europe it's often externalized as an American problem. Another response from students of color is, hey, I know this story. I see myself in this book. And then a third response, which is really interesting, is students getting angry at Camara for not being a good enough ally, because she does a lot of explaining about how she could have been a better sister to her father, a better daughter to her father, a better sister to her brother. And it's very clear that Black masculinity is a very vulnerable category in Norway in her book. And she's putting that process of self-critique on display. And sometimes students come back at that vulnerability and be like, she should be better, or she should. And I noticed that a lot in student responses to activists, indigenous activists and activists of color in the materials I teach. I think I've just given you a lot of information, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, part of what you were saying, what it brought up for me was the reaction to it and ideas around it. And so I spent the last 3 months giving book talks in Norway and in Sweden and in Finland. And one of the things that I was always very intentional about saying was clearly pointing out that this is a book about Sweden, that, you know, sort of it's where the data come from, this is where the materials are from, but it is not just a Swedish story, right? There are enough similarities and enough closeness to what people experience in the Nordics, and, you know, and then we can sort of think about Europe and beyond as well, but while recognizing that there are contextual differences, I think there's something really important to this working towards this critical consciousness and realization of the ways in which racialization is a part of the Nordics and has a history. It didn't just, you know, sort of come on the scene a few weeks ago. So, yeah. And I was also thinking about with Camara's work on this, and I don't know if I have the term exactly correct, but I'm using the language of sort of a gentle strength, or sort of a gentleness that is deceivingly gentle, right? In order to do work around white audiences primarily being able to hear what is being said or take that in. And yeah, I wonder about how that plays out in the different ways in which her work is received by different audiences.
I'd love to open up to the audience momentarily, but I have one further question, which is about the process of writing itself. As I was thinking and reflecting on both books, and also you both as colleagues and friends, I kept going back to Bell Hook's essay, Choosing the Margins as a Space of Radical Openness, and how in that essay she keeps repeating this: language is a site of struggle, language is a site of struggle. So I'm just wondering from you, like, what it took to actually do the writing. Were you alone? Were you in company? Did you have music, headphones running? What were you doing? I kind of geek out about how writers do what they do.
Thank you for that question. It's been an interesting process. There are translators in the room who have much more sophisticated ideas about how translation works than I do yet. I can keep working on this. But I translated this book really quickly because I need to teach it. So it was pretty fast, and luckily Norwegian is a lot like English. So actually Google Translate, I didn't use Google Translate for this project. I did not, don't worry. Yeah, no AI involved here. But it is close. English and Norwegian are very similar. So there's a way in which I was able to speed translate for the functional purpose of teaching at first. But then I had to go back over it again and again and again and again, and thank goodness I had years to do that, and also colleagues to do that. Support from graduate students as well, who helped to workshop the translation. So a lot of
Translation, in a way, this back translation practice where you have to go back and check whether meaning has been transferred,
yes,
rather than just language itself.
Yeah, and checking it against the Norwegian, but also checking it against English. So translating from the Norwegian, then making sure to work with the text without the Norwegian, because it can influence then kind of the phrasing in strange ways, and that long process. You had asked earlier how Scandinavian studies has changed, and in one of the workshop processes with a graduate student, there was a question of, do you think there will be resistance to publishing this book? Because it doesn't tell a story that people want to hear or are used to. And this is a big change in that the answer is absolutely not. I think this book it was not a problem to find a publisher for this book. This is something people are interested and they want to hear about. So that I imagine is a kind of change.
Yeah. Process. So this book took a long time. It felt like it took longer than I wanted to. And the way that I started it, I I borrowed from Sarah Ahmed the idea of following something around. So I used the idea of following Afro-Swedishness around to find out what I could learn through that process. And I am a strong believer in sort of methodological promiscuity, if you will. That's not like a jumping around. That is recognizing that there are, sometimes you need more than one way to do work, and in doing that you need to deeply understand that work, so you can't not do the jumping. And so, there are things like that that made it take longer than I had originally planned. COVID, sort of life things happen, and I think there were ways in which, there were points where that was very frustrating to me, but in talking to colleagues and really thinking about the work, something that was very helpful for me was being reminded that, I was stuck in Western linear notions of time, right? And sometimes work needs to take the time it takes. And I mean, those of you that write or are in art or whatever, it's like, when it's ready. When you've done what it is that you set out to do. And so, so that was certainly part of the process. I think the other thing I can say about process is, because there's so many voices, so many narratives in the text, for a long time I felt a heavy sense of responsibility to those with whom I was in conversation with and in community with. And I did so not just because I think, we should always feel that way in doing qualitative work, but also because I knew that it was so hard for my colleagues in the Swedish Academy to do this kind of work, to get the time, the resources, to even have this type of work be accepted, if you will. And so it was also a project that was in solidarity with those folks, and so that was important to me. And so with that heaviness, if you will, I had to get myself to a place where I was clear about this being, this is my work, these are my perspectives, this is how I understand this analysis, and sort of this is what I'm offering, this is what I can offer to this conversation, to this discourse, and hope that people will take it up in meaningful ways.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have some time. Do we have a little bit of time to open up for some questions? Short ones.
Thank you for the stimulating conversation, really interesting. My question was, oftentimes it was very interesting to hear you speak about writing, an excellent question about the writing process and finding an audience for these books. In thinking about that, oftentimes people ask, well, what is the competition? What other kinds of books are there that are out there like this one? And I just wondered if you had any reflections on where your book fits in books fit in relationship to books that are out there already. Thanks.
I mean, I think this book definitely fills a gap in terms of English language texts that deal with Afro-Swedishness. I think it functions in some ways as an archival document because it does span about a decade of events, and then I sort of use the epilogue to bring it up to present day. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In Sweden, there certainly are, I mean, there are articles, not as many books on this. There are some books, but what is always interesting, I found, with Swedish book publications, there are a lot of books that take up these types of things that are published, self-published, or sort of published by popular press rather than in academic settings and academic contexts. And so I think for me, or my hope with this, is that it provides something important for graduate students in Sweden that are trying to do some of this work.
Reading Nana's book, this past couple of weeks, I see a lot of connections between the stories that are in Nana's book and Camara's, the stories that she's telling. And of course, I mean, the book in some ways is a contribution to Black European studies, I hope. So it enables, for example, our colleague, Monica L. Miller, who co-wrote the introduction to Camara's book together with Nana. She's taught this in her Black European studies courses at Columbia. Barnard. Thank you. And there isn't as much translated work coming out of the Nordics for those kinds of courses, so that's a contribution, probably more translated work in, for example, German studies. So that's one thing. And the stories that are being told here have resonances, of course, with Gloria Wecker's work on white innocence. So there's a lot of Black feminist European work, I think, that's out there. The other thing I wanted to mention, very interestingly, is a Black feminist scholar, Jennifer Nash, recently came to the University of Washington and gave a talk a couple of years ago. And she was talking about a course she teaches at Duke, which is the entire reading list is New York Times best-selling Black feminist popular texts and memoirs. And she's like, that I can do that since 2016. I couldn't do that before. And I do think that people are interested in those books, hopefully will be interested also in these books. Yeah, those are a few thoughts I have.
Thank you for this really rich conversation. I have a question for Nana, and it's because I fortunately received this book in the mail last week and have started reading it, and I'd love to hear you say more about the collaboration, not collaboration, sorry, I'm blanking on the C word.
Like coalition identity information.
Thank you. Coalition, how coalition it plays into Afro-Swedish Places of Belonging.
Yeah, definitely. And a quick note just on the previous question, that one of the things I'm thinking about with that is that I would hope and want to see this type of work also taught in African diaspora studies, to be able to teach about Black populations that don't necessarily come through the Middle Passage. I think that's really, really important. Now, so coalitional identity and formation is sort of one of the, I guess, the big idea in the text. And the way that I think about it is about different ways in which Black folks in Sweden think of themselves as kin, so creating kinships, and kinships can be, they can be literally kinships, and they can also be metaphorical kinships, but that is a very important and powerful way through which people come together to be in community. And it is, I think, important to say that it's not an assumed community, like you just say, this is what's happening here, it is, just show up and now we're a community, right? So it's, that is the aim, right? There's an aim around solidarity, but it's absolutely not given. And there are ways in which, you know, who we are and what language we use gets contested as people are trying to figure this out. Is there community? No, there's not. Well, yes, there is. And part of what, there's some good writing on the idea that if we are already at a place where we're arguing about whether a community exists, that tells us that it does in fact exist, right? Because we're arguing about it. And so, yeah, so that's part of what I used in the text around that.
That reminds me of a little bit about Camara's trajectory as an artist, because she is the playwright in residence at the National Theater right now, and is writing a third play, or a third play is about to be staged. But she has goals of moving towards being able to make more separatist art, so art that isn't always for white audiences predominantly, and you talk about this a little bit in your book, that need to have those kinds of spaces. And then she's also anxious in her book a lot about speaking for others, which I think is related to this question of coalition. And, you know, I don't have the same experience as you, but we are in community together. So she expresses a lot of anxiety about her success, and that her success, I was just listening to her talk about this morning, her success was originally built on trying really, really hard to fit in white spaces. And that she worried that process made less room for other Black voices. And that part of her work now, or her plans for future art projects, have to do with making sure that she doesn't continue those kinds of practices. So.
No, I was just thinking as you were saying that this idea about sort of thinking about the individual and the fear and those types of things, where I like to think about Afro-Swedishness as a coalition identity and formation as a political category, right? As a political category of identity and we might even think about it as an umbrella category where, you know, there are things that fall below where people say, yeah, in my day-to-day relationships, I identify as Black, but something is happening here politically where this is a term that has captured the public imagination, where we have studies, we have research that uses this language. So, you know, how can we use this in a way that serves the work that we're trying to do?
Do we have?
I have a lot of questions that are kind of swirling, so I'm going to try to make this one thought. As someone who's lived abroad in Denmark, I can speak to the fact that conversations around racism and just like Scandinavian racism are very much dismissed and avoided by white people. And I, through hearing you talk, wonder if, like, in your books you explored how the, like, cultural homogeny and, like, pressure to assimilate adds to those feelings of color evasiveness or discomfort around real language, like Olivia was speaking to, of, like, not publishing the N-word in the Swedish text. Do you think that, like, that culture of homogeny and fits into that in some way?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. This is interesting for me as a white American who maybe doesn't always do the best job of, like, drawing clear lines between American contexts and Norwegian contexts. And that might have to do with me being also a comparatist and wanting to see kind of connections, and I see so many connections. I'm working on an article on Camara's work right now, and the big work ahead of me is figuring out the Norwegianness of this text. And that's a really big question for me. I think importantly, the notion of homogeneity is itself problematic in the Nordic context. There's a lot less of it than people think, but there is a kind of, like, maybe normalization of ways that are okay of speaking and ways that are not okay of speaking, and so it's a little more ideological homogeneity and some pressures there. So that's some thoughts I have, and I think Camara, you know, her book is partially about the process of learning to be a better ally to other Black and brown people as a Black woman. So she takes that on in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I also think part of what you're hitting on is this idea that sameness equals equality, or, I mean, and they would probably say sameness equals equity, and so, but I think that's, yeah, exactly. That's where it all falls down, right? So, alla ska behandlas samma, right? We're all treated the same. That's rätt ska vara rätt. And what we have to attend to here is to find a deep understanding of equity, meaning, you know, people get what they need, right? And people's needs being met where they are, because we're not all starting from the same place.
Yeah, we started off with stories, and I'm thinking about the day I met Afro-Brazilian feminist, very well-known feminist, Sueli Carneiro Yashuel. And she was in Oslo, and we were walking the parks and the streets of Oslo. Her daughter is a performance artist who lives there, and we were talking about, the future of Black studies, Black culture, what this language means. And one of the things she said that really has sort of haunted me was that in order for us to continue to innovate and imagine alternatives, all of us, we will have to collectively agree that everything that is produced by people of African descent in the diaspora on the continent, everything constitutes Black culture. No matter how it is positioned, no matter how is it expressed, no matter whether it's got internalized racism or no internalized racism, all of it. And there was something about like the expansiveness, the elasticity, the challenge that sort of posed that has stuck with me. And as you've been talking and thinking about the words in these two books, I'm struck by this, the multiplicities, the pluriverses that are kind of emerging in a healthy way so that we can imagine new possibilities for these communities that are unfolding and emerging and transforming right now. Yeah. Thank you all for joining us and for being with us today. Thank you. And thank you. Thank you.